Princess Anne did not arrive with an advisor, a lawyer, or a palace secretary. She came alone, carrying one final financial note left by Queen Elizabeth, an instruction that had remained sealed through months of uncertainty. But when King Charles finally opened it, the room changed. Halfway down the page was a name he had not expected to see given such extraordinary weight: William. And what Elizabeth had written beside that name made Charles stop reading. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne requested the meeting herself, insisting there would be no aides or prepared briefing. The financial note was a private instruction about how family wealth should be protected, separate from public money used for official royal duties. She told Charles that Elizabeth had placed it among her final papers with one condition: release it only when long-term responsibility for those assets could no longer be avoided. His attention never left the page. Then the meaning became unmistakable. Elizabeth had named Prince William as the family member she wanted entrusted with oversight of a protected reserve for the monarchy's next generation. The prince was not being handed a fortune. He was being given responsibility to question withdrawals and resist pressure when short-term demands threatened long-term security. Charles read his son's name twice. He lowered the paper and looked at Anne. Did she really mean for this to happen while I was king? Anne felt the weight immediately. She had guarded the note because her mother trusted her, yet honoring Elizabeth's wish now meant risking pain inside the family she tried to steady. She told her brother the instruction was never written to humiliate him. Charles was still sovereign, the monarch with constitutional authority and the central duty of the crown. But financial stewardship meant something narrower: responsibility for guarding private assets against decisions driven by pressure, convenience, or competing interests. Charles turned back to the handwriting. One line stopped him again. Elizabeth had written that the reserve must be protected from personal pressure, immediate convenience, and competing households. Those words were too precise to dismiss. He knew his mother did not choose language carelessly, and Anne knew exactly why that sentence existed. Charles finally asked what had happened before Elizabeth wrote it. Anne hesitated for the first time since entering the room. Then she admitted there had been a confrontation involving William, one the family had never publicly discussed. Charles thought he had been handed a financial instruction. Anne was about to reveal that he had actually been handed the final chapter of an argument Elizabeth never forgot. For Charles, the note threatened something more fragile than authority: the belief that his mother had fully trusted the future he intended to build. For Anne, it reopened the burden of being the daughter Elizabeth trusted with uncomfortable truths. And for William, who had not yet been told that his grandmother had written his name into her final financial instructions, the document represented a responsibility he never requested, but one Elizabeth apparently believed he would someday need. Charles turned away from the table, carrying two identities: monarch and son. As sovereign, he remained the constitutional head of the monarchy, carrying its highest public duty. But that did little to ease the private wound. What troubled him was the possibility that Elizabeth had anticipated moments when her eldest son might need his heir to question him. Anne saw that fear before he spoke. Anne had inherited no money from the instruction and no special authority over its future. She had been given custody, meaning she was trusted to preserve the note until Elizabeth's condition was met. That burden now felt heavier than privilege. She had obeyed her mother, yet risked reopening an old fracture with Charles. He asked, "Did William know?" Charles felt relief when Anne answered no, but it vanished quickly. William had not asked for this role, or even known it existed. Yet the king now had to decide how his son would learn that Elizabeth had placed such confidence in him. Anne reminded him that the prince had spent years hearing the late queen describe inheritance as duty, not reward. William remembered those lessons differently. Elizabeth had never treated future kingship as permission to take more. In private conversations later recorded in Anne's documented account, she warned her grandson that protecting the institution could mean disappointing people he loved. The future king listened. Now those words had become an obligation written into the family's finances. Anne pointed to something Charles had missed. Elizabeth had sealed the note separately from ordinary estate arrangements, the routine instructions governing private property after death. She wanted it treated as a moral directive, not paperwork. The language did not enrich William. It burdened him with oversight and the duty to challenge spending that could weaken what younger generations inherited. Then Anne finally told Charles why. Elizabeth had not created the arrangement from theory. She had written it after one precise family meeting, when William looked directly at the Queen, rejected a financial proposal placed before her, and refused to change his answer. To understand why Elizabeth trusted him, Charles would have to return to the afternoon his mother watched her grandson say no, and never forgot it all those years. There had been one afternoon when Elizabeth stopped seeing William simply as the grandson preparing for kingship, and began seeing him as a guardian, capable of resisting the family itself. The meeting was private, the disagreement uncomfortable, and the decision seemingly forgotten once everyone left the room. But Elizabeth remembered. According to the note Anne now placed before Charles, that single confrontation became the trigger for one of her most consequential final financial instructions. Elizabeth had gathered Charles, Anne, William, and senior household representatives to consider whether a large reserve of private family assets should support expanded residences, staffing, and future household commitments. Those private assets were family-controlled funds, separate from public money used for official duties, which meant careless withdrawals could weaken what later generations inherited. William arrived expecting routine discussion. Then he studied the projections and realized repeated spending could turn present comfort into a future burden. William did not soften his objection. He looked toward Elizabeth and said he could not support the proposal because future kings should not inherit yesterday's comfort as tomorrow's obligation. Charles immediately felt the force of those words. Anne remained silent, watching her mother absorb them. The Queen did not argue. Instead, she asked everyone except her grandson to leave, and the sudden privacy made the disagreement far more serious than anyone had expected. William admitted that he feared sounding disrespectful, yet he told his grandmother loyalty meant saying what others might prefer not to hear. Elizabeth listened without praising him, then asked the question that would define everything later. Would he make the same argument if Charles himself requested the money? The prince hesitated because he understood exactly what she was testing. Then he said yes. He would oppose even his father if protecting the future required it. Anne now explained to Charles, through her documented account of that evening, what happened after the meeting. Elizabeth asked her to record the date and preserve the financial projections. Those projections were estimates showing how repeated withdrawals could reduce long-term resources. The papers eventually remained beside the final note, proving the decision had grown from that exact confrontation. Charles read another handwritten observation from his mother. Elizabeth had concluded that William could separate affection from duty. To her, that was the heart of financial stewardship, protecting shared resources even when personal relationships made refusal painful. Charles finally understood why his son had been chosen. But understanding brought a harder decision. He could honor Elizabeth's instruction immediately, or challenge it before William ever discovered what his grandmother had placed upon him. The mystery was over. The danger was not. Charles now had to decide whether he could accept what Elizabeth had already decided. When William entered the room, he believed Charles wanted to discuss routine family finances. Then he saw Anne standing beside the table and Elizabeth's handwriting in front of his father. No secretary remained. No advisor could soften the language. Charles pushed the note toward his son and asked him to read the final paragraph. William reached his own name, stopped, and looked up. What followed was not a constitutional argument. It was a father and son confronting inheritance. Charles had chosen honesty because hiding the instruction would only make the eventual wound deeper. Anne remained because she could confirm where the document came from, and when Elizabeth intended it to be released. The protected reserve meant a private pool of family assets, preserved for long-term royal needs rather than ordinary personal spending. William understood immediately that overseeing it could force him to challenge decisions made by the very man sitting across from him. Charles watched his son finish reading. Then the question came, sharp and painfully personal. "Did she think you would protect it from me?" William closed the note and placed both hands on the table. He refused to answer with anger. Elizabeth, he said, had trusted them with different responsibilities. His father carried the crown. He had been given the burden of protecting one part of what came after it. Charles did not let him escape that easily. He asked whether William would actually oppose him if he believed a withdrawal threatened the reserve. The prince hesitated, and the silence exposed how much the answer hurt. Then he said yes. Accepting Elizabeth's trust meant he could not promise automatic agreement, even to his father. Charles stared at him, hearing loyalty and defiance in the same sentence. Anne finally stepped in. She explained that Elizabeth had never given William unlimited control. Every major decision required documented justification, meaning written reasons that could later be reviewed against the purpose of the fund. The Queen had built accountability into the system. She had not replaced Charles. She had made it harder for any one person to act without challenge. Charles returned to the final clause and felt the pressure deepen. If William refused the responsibility, control would not simply return to the king. The reserve would move into independent trusteeship, where designated custodians, rather than one royal, would protect it. Elizabeth had anticipated refusal. She had anticipated resistance. William left only after his father dismissed him. Anne stayed behind. Charles waited until the door closed. Then he looked at his sister and asked the question he had resisted all evening. What exactly can I still change? William had survived the confrontation. Charles was now discovering how carefully Elizabeth had limited everyone's power, including his own. Charles expected to discover a mechanism he could revise. Instead, he discovered his mother had anticipated revision itself. Elizabeth's final note did not hand William a fortune or reduce the king to a spectator. It created something subtler, a system in which no single member of the family could treat protected wealth as personal convenience. But the more Charles understood the arrangement, the clearer one uncomfortable truth became. His mother had designed it around human weakness, not royal titles. Anne explained how carefully Elizabeth had divided responsibility. Charles would retain sovereign family leadership, meaning the final public authority and duty attached to the reigning monarch. William would oversee the protected reserve, while designated trustees would verify that major withdrawals matched the purposes laid down in the note. The money was meant to support education, essential residences, long-term security, and future generations, not become an easy answer whenever one household faced pressure. Charles asked Anne to leave him alone with the document for a moment. He studied his mother's signature and ran his thumb across the final line, searching for something softer than the meaning already staring back at him. When his sister returned, he admitted what truly hurt. It was not losing control. It was realizing Elizabeth had believed control itself could one day become a family problem. Anne did not retreat from that truth. She told her brother that Elizabeth understood the pressure monarchs faced from people they loved. Charles bristled, but she reminded him that their mother had spent 70 years watching private affection become institutional obligation. One exception could become an expectation. One emotional decision could survive for decades. The Queen had learned that loyalty sometimes required building limits before anyone needed them. Anne then revealed something even harder through the dated papers she had preserved. Elizabeth had drafted an earlier version, giving Charles sole discretion over the reserve. She changed it only after the meeting in which William challenged the spending proposal. That revision proved the structure was no accident. The monarch had seen her grandson resist pressure and decided the safeguard needed more than one conscience. Charles turned another page and found the final surprise. William's responsibility was to begin while his father was still alive, not after succession. Elizabeth believed stewardship had to be tested before kingship, because power learned only after accession came too late. Charles sat with that sentence before finally agreeing to activate the arrangement. Anne heard the decision and understood what it cost him, but the relief lasted only briefly. William's first test arrived almost immediately. An existing financial commitment now required his approval. Elizabeth's safeguard had survived its first emotional collision. Now the prince would have to prove he could enforce it, when saying no carried a personal cost. William had barely accepted the responsibility when the first request arrived. There was no ceremonial introduction, no comfortable period in which he could grow into Elizabeth's expectations. A substantial allocation already awaiting renewal required approval from the protected reserve. Signing it would preserve peace. Questioning it would immediately prove that his new authority was real. William sat with the papers for several minutes, picked up his pen, and chose the harder path. William studied the request again before making his decision. The commitment had been approved before Elizabeth's revised safeguards existed, and nothing about it was illegal or scandalous. The problem was harder than that. Its long-term purpose was weak. Under the standards his grandmother had created, protected spending had to serve a clear, continuing need, rather than survive, simply because changing it would upset someone. That distinction made the prince uncomfortable, because he knew exactly who would feel the consequences. William returned the request without approval, and asked for a lower figure supported by clear justification. He understood that stewardship did not mean cutting money whenever possible. It meant separating genuine royal necessity from arrangements maintained mainly to avoid personal discomfort. Once the papers left his desk, he remained alone for several minutes. The future king had defended the principle before. Now the principle carried names, relationships, and consequences. Charles received notice quickly. At first, the king read the decision as a challenge aimed directly at him. He entered his son's room carrying the returned request, but anger never became an outburst. Instead, he asked why William could not approve the arrangement temporarily, while a better solution was found. The prince looked at his father and knew this was the test Elizabeth had anticipated. William opened the written criteria and pointed to the rule governing exceptions. A temporary allowance, he explained, could easily become a permanent obligation if nobody challenged it later. Charles went quiet. The argument sounded painfully familiar. Years earlier, his son had used the same logic before Elizabeth, refusing to let present comfort become a burden inherited by the future. Charles finally placed the request back on the desk. He did not overrule William. He told him to negotiate a sustainable alternative, one that protected the people involved without weakening the reserve. For the first time, Elizabeth's arrangement changed not just who held responsibility, but how father and son exercised power together. William should have felt relieved. Instead, he carried a deeper fear from the room. Enforcing his grandmother's wishes was one thing. Knowing whether Charles privately resented him for doing it was another. The financial crisis had begun to settle, but the deeper wound remained untouched, until Charles sought William out without Anne, trustees, or palace officials anywhere near them. There was no document on the table when Charles asked William to stay behind. No Anne, no secretary, no financial advisor capable of turning emotion into procedure. For the first time since Elizabeth's note appeared, the two men faced what it had truly exposed. Charles was not frightened of William having responsibility. He was frightened of what the responsibility seemed to say about Elizabeth's final judgment of him. And William finally understood the difference. Charles chose his words carefully. Elizabeth had spent his entire life preparing him to carry responsibility. Yet her final safeguard felt like a correction, written into his reign before he had fully settled into it. The safeguard was the system she created to protect certain family assets from being controlled by one person alone. To the king, that structure had first sounded less like protection and more like a warning from his mother. William did not answer quickly. He told his father he had never read the note as a verdict against him. The prince believed Elizabeth had created complementary duties, meaning separate responsibilities, designed to strengthen each other rather than compete. The monarchy had become too complicated, too pressured, and too exposed for one person to carry every decision without challenge. In his mind, the arrangement did not weaken Charles. It forced both men to think beyond themselves. Charles finally admitted what had been haunting him. "I read your name and heard a criticism she never actually wrote." William felt the sentence land heavily. He told his father that when he saw his own name, he had not felt triumph. He had felt fear. The future king knew that accepting Elizabeth's trust might one day force him to oppose Charles, and he had worried that duty could damage the relationship between them. William then made the offer neither man expected to hear aloud. If the responsibility truly threatened to divide them, he would refuse it. Charles reacted immediately. He told his son not to abandon a duty merely to protect the king's pride. For the first time, the tension shifted. The argument was no longer about who held more power. It was about whether either man could carry responsibility without making it personal. Charles then revealed something he had discovered after rereading the note several times. Elizabeth had written that the arrangement would succeed only if father and son learned to disagree, without confusing disagreement for disloyalty. The words changed everything. Charles handed William the original note, not a copy. If Elizabeth trusted him to guard the reserve, he said, then he should also carry the reminder of why that trust existed. Their reconciliation remained private. But within hours, the secret was no longer contained. Inside the family, the note had finally stopped being a weapon. Outside the palace, William's name was about to become the headline everyone wanted to interpret. By morning, a private family reckoning had become a national conversation. The public did not see the hours Charles spent wrestling with Elizabeth's intention or William's offer to surrender the responsibility. They saw one explosive fact. The late queen had placed her grandson's name at the center of a final financial instruction. Some interpreted it as succession planning. Others saw a grandmother's final lesson in restraint. But one public moment captured the story more powerfully than any analysis. Charles approved a carefully worded palace communication, confirming the essential arrangement, without exposing private figures. The statement explained that Elizabeth had established a protected family reserve and assigned William a stewardship role alongside the king and designated trustees. Stewardship meant responsibility for guarding and reviewing the use of those assets. It did not mean owning them outright. That distinction mattered because the announcement concerned financial duty, not a hidden transfer of royal power. William disliked the reaction almost immediately. Commentators began asking whether his grandmother had trusted him more than his father, turning a shared system into a contest between two men. Before leaving for a scheduled engagement, the prince told Charles that he feared Elizabeth's confidence in him would be interpreted as rejection of the monarch. The king listened without interrupting. Then he made a decision his son had not expected. Charles refused to hide their cooperation. He told William that retreating into separate appearances would only strengthen the idea that the note had divided them. The monarch wanted the public to see what Elizabeth had actually created. responsibility shared across generations, not authority stolen from one by another. William understood the risk, but he agreed. Outside Buckingham Palace, visitors gathered near the gates as the story dominated the morning cycle. One newspaper carried the stark front page, "Elizabeth's Final Trust. Why William?" Television broadcasters repeated the question, while explaining that the arrangement had not made the prince king, displaced Charles, or handed him unrestricted wealth. The late queen had given her grandson a demanding duty, not an early crown. Charles and William answered the speculation without a speech. Later that day, they arrived together at the same royal engagement. The king acknowledged his son's new responsibility openly, while the future king stayed close beside him. One shared appearance did more than hours of commentary. The image of division began to weaken. But Anne still held something neither man had read. Elizabeth had left one final personal message, to be opened only after the financial struggle was settled. The world had debated her money and William's authority. Anne was about to reveal that her mother's final concern had never truly been financial at all. Anne waited until the arguments had ended before revealing the final lines. Elizabeth had anticipated that money would attract attention, that William's name would invite speculation, and that Charles might initially interpret shared responsibility as diminished trust. But the closing message stripped away every institutional layer. Her final financial note was never merely about protecting assets. It was about protecting a relationship and teaching two future kings that the crown becomes weaker whenever pride becomes more important than stewardship. Anne brought Charles and William together one final time and placed the personal message before them. She explained that Elizabeth had ordered it to remain sealed until the financial arrangement was fully accepted. The protected reserve, a private pool of family assets preserved for future needs, had become more than a financial safeguard. In the Queen's final words, it was a test of continuity. Charles had to lead without fearing challenge, while his son had to challenge without mistaking responsibility for superiority. Charles began reading aloud, but the words became harder when the message turned personal. Elizabeth had written that preparing William was part of her son's kingship, not a threat to it. The king stopped. Anne quietly finished the sentence from the documented message, making clear that their mother believed strong leadership required creating room for the next generation before the crown actually passed to it. Charles listened, no longer hearing criticism in every line. William then told his father what he had carried since seeing his name on the note. He had never wanted Elizabeth's instruction to place him between Charles and the monarchy. The prince had feared becoming a symbol of replacement, when he had only been given responsibility. Charles answered with a truth that finally ended the conflict. His mistake had been assuming there was room for only one person to be trusted at a time. The meaning of William's name was now unmistakable. Elizabeth had not chosen a secret replacement for Charles. She had given her grandson responsibility before succession, the formal process by which the crown eventually passes to the next monarch, so that restraint and accountability would become habits before he ever became king. Charles accepted the arrangement. William accepted the stewardship. Anne's final duty as guardian of Elizabeth's instruction was complete. She left the original note with the future king and the personal message with her brother, giving each man the part of their mother's legacy meant for him. Elizabeth's final decision had moved far more than money. It had forced a father and son to understand that authority was strongest when responsibility could be shared. Charles emerged stronger because he accepted challenge. William emerged humbled because trust brought weight, not privilege. Anne completed the task her mother had placed in her hands. The note began with William's name and nearly reopened an old royal wound. But by the time Charles folded it for the final time, Elizabeth's purpose had succeeded. One king had learned to share responsibility, another had learned how heavy responsibility could be, and a family once divided by inheritance finally understood what their queen had actually left behind.